Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. Today we have the 2.5 meter ASK14 Glider. This thing is awesome. It's my first glider and we're going to take you back to the workbench. I'll show you guys how to assemble this and then we'll have a little bit of flight video at the end. Check this out, guys. Okay, well, just like any other 3D printed airplane, the first thing we gotta do is throw all the pieces on the printer and get everything printed out. I've been printing for a couple days. I got all the fuselage parts printed. I got a couple of the smaller pieces printed out so I can start assembling the fuselage. If you guys are having problems with 3D printing your thin wall, I'll throw a link up in the description for that and up in the cards. So you guys can click on that if you guys are having problems with getting your retraction settings set up right and all that kind of stuff. Get that perfect test piece. Now that we got all these parts printed out, I got a couple more days of printing on the wing. I did the first part last night. It's about 8 hours of printing. So I got the first piece done. Second part's on the printer now. While that's finishing up printing, I am going to start working on assembling the fuselage. And then by the time I get all this ready to fly and electronics and everything added in it, hopefully the wing will be pretty close to being done. So let's start working on getting this thing assembled. So just make sure that your parts fit together easily and there's no gaps or anything. That way you have good glue adhesion there. There's on fuselage 1, you got to remove this part here, so we'll go ahead and do that. And then make sure that all your bodin tubes, that the wire goes into the bodin tubes easily in the fuselage. So this one, it actually works a lot easier than the last plane that I did. So just make sure that your bodin tube goes in there easily. It's a lot easier to work with them when they're small pieces like this and until you got a whole tail section of fuselage and you're having problems with that. So make sure that you do it this step before you get gluing this together. So we'll start gluing this together. We're gonna start with these two middle pieces here, and we'll start getting this thing glued together. For this build, I used red PLA for the fuselage, and I used white PETG for the wing, and I used lightweight PLA for the tail sections. This airplane took around 120 hours of continuous printing to print, and I printed all the parts out on my Artillery Sidewinder, and I have a review video up for that printer and some tips to set it up for your thin wall printing on my YouTube channel. I also have some how to print thin wall videos up too. You guys can check out if you guys are having problems printing your thin wall. For this part here, I'm going to use a hot knife to cut this support piece out, and then I'll use a cold knife just to clean up the edge there. I use Zap-A-Gap medium CA glue to glue all the parts together. For this canopy, I use clear PETG to print this out. Make sure when you're gluing this together to use a small amount of glue because it will kind of fog up the PETG a little bit. So just make sure to use a small amount of it and then set it in place. These are 5mm square magnets. I glued the one into the fuselage and I'll put the other one on to the top of it. And I'll take a marker and just mark the top side of it, and then I'll just use CA glue to insert that into the canopy just to make sure that you have the polarity correct for the magnets. For these rudder and elevator parts that we print out of lightweight PLA to save a little bit of weight, because they're printed together on the build plate, there's not any way to minimize that stringing, but it just takes a little bit of cleaning up with the X-Acto blade to get those cleaned up. And then when you just need to remove those couple sections I just removed there for this rudder, and then we'll glue it together. Now I'll take this 1.2 millimeter carbon rod and we'll insert that into the rudder, and we'll set these hinges in place. And then I'll just cut this. I'll leave it long for now just so I can remove it. And then we'll make sure that these move nice and free, and then we'll put just a little dab of CA glue, insert that into the tail here, and then we'll pull that carbon rod back out, remove the rudder, and then we'll just add a little bit more CA glue to those hinges just to make sure that they're set in place. Now you're going to want to clean up these parts where the carbon rod fits into for the elevator. So we'll clean up those, and then we'll make sure that this tube fits into the slots easily, because that'll just determine that that elevator, pivots really easily right there on that tail section. So we'll make sure that pivots easily, and then we'll glue this part together. We'll insert our 1.2 millimeter steel wire in place with a Z-bend on one end. And then we'll insert this fitting into the tail, and make sure you do all this before you glue that rudder on. So then we'll put these carbon tubes in place, and then again just make sure that they move easily right there. If they don't, just got to clean up those parts a little bit, or make sure that the push rod slides easily into the fuselage. And then we'll insert the two halves of the elevator in place, and we'll flip it over, and we'll drill the carbon tube, and then we'll insert the screw in the bottom. Okay, with the elevator installed, now we can finish assembling the rudder. So we'll insert the rudder onto those hinges, put the 1.2 millimeter carbon rod in place, and then we'll set up the push rod. So I'll use a 1.2 millimeter steel rod, put a Z-bend on one end, insert that into the fuselage, put the control horn in place, glue that in place onto the rudder, and then we'll insert this skid plate here on the back of the tail section. With the rudder installed, this is a time to just final check and make sure that these controls move really easily. Once I know that they move easily and there's no other adjustments, then we can just put a little dab of CA glue on that carbon rod and insert that into the rudder, and that'll hold it in place. Now I'll set up the servos for the rudder and the elevator. I'm using HS55 servos. So we'll cut these control horns down. I'll drill a hole in the control horn to make it fit these push rod connectors. We'll put the nut on there, and then we'll put a little CA glue, and I'll hit that with a CA accelerator to keep that nut from coming off. And then we'll insert these servos into the servo brackets, and I'll use M2x10 screws to mount that bracket into the fuselage. And then I left the push rods along there for the rudder and the elevator, so that way we can cut them to length once I hook all this up. I'll be using a Spectrum AR620 receiver. So you want to hook those up and center the servos and make sure that they're in the center position, and then we can insert the control horn and have it in the correct position once the servo is centered. And then you want to center the rudder and the elevator, and then set this set screw for the push rod connectors. And once you have that set up, then we can just cut these push rods to length, and then it'll be all set up. Okay, now we'll start setting up the motor. I'm using a 3536 1450 kV motor with a 60 amp ESC. And as you can see from this, the motor shaft is not in the correct position to set up for the motor mount. So for me to get the motor that has the motor shaft in the correct position, it would have to get it from China, and it takes quite a while. So this was the closest thing I could get for a motor. But if you can order a motor with the shaft in the correct position, you can save yourself from doing all this work I'm doing here. But If you wanted to do what I'm doing, that's fine. You just have to reposition the shaft. So you take the 2 set screws out, and then you got to make sure you grind that flat spot back on the shaft so that the set screws will set on that flat part of the shaft. And then in order to keep this bearing in the front of the motor here, we need to file a groove. So I put the motor shaft together, take a Dremel there, and I mark the spot. I put tape on there, and then I'm going to put it into this paper towel to prevent any metal shavings from getting into the magnets there. And then I'll use my Dremel with a thin blade, and I'll cut a groove into this shaft here, and then we'll just reassemble it. And you can see there that there's a little groove right in front of that bearing, and then I'll reinsert this keeper pin. And I'll just use a little bit of blue Loctite for these screws into the motor. And then we'll hook up the ESC and make sure that the motor spins the correct direction. If it spins the wrong direction like it does here for me, then I'll just switch the blue and the red wire on the ESC, and that'll change the direction of the motor. And then we can insert that into the fuselage. With this cowling, I'm having a little bit of clearance issues. It's hitting the top 2 screws. You can see there's a gap there, and it's hitting those 2 top screws on the motor mount. So I'm just going to use a Dremel and just file out a couple of notches there, and then that'll fit just right on those top screws. And then we'll insert this in place. We'll drill out the spinner a little bit to fit onto the prop adapter I'm going to use. Now for this motor setup, the prop adapter does not fit all the way down onto that motor shaft, but I tightened it down really tight, and I've already flown it, and I did full power run-ups and everything like that. I didn't have any problems. For setting up the retracts, we're going to need a 3mm carbon rod and a 3mm steel rod. These retracts were a little difficult for me to find with a 32 by 25mm mounting plate, but I was able to find quite a few different links. Some of them were out of stock, some of them have stock, so I'll throw a whole bunch of links in the description below. I think I have like 3 or 4 links to these retracts from different websites and stuff, so hopefully one of these links will have some retracts in stock for you guys. When you guys are building these models, just use the assembling manual that Planeprint has to get all the exact measurements for all the carbon rods and tubes and everything. But we want to cut this steel rod at 75mm, and then we want to cut these 2 notches at 4mm and 21 to match up for that retract on the wheel, and then you want to cut 1 on the top for the retract, and just make sure that it's 90 degrees to the other 2. So that way your wheel sits nice and straight. For these 3mm screws, I ended up just getting actually longer screws than I needed, and then I cut them down to length and just make sure that they tighten down onto the shaft and not onto the actual fitting of the gear. And then you want to add these bands to the retract, and you have to add a whole bunch of them to make that pretty strong. Well, with the fuselage all complete, we'll set this aside and we'll start working on the wing. The wing's pretty easy to assemble. There's a lot of pieces to it just because it's such a large wingspan, but just make sure that you have your carbon tubes. Make sure that they fit into all of the wing sections without any problems. If you're having some problems with it, you can put a drill on the end of this and then run it into the pieces. They're a lot easier to get it to work, when it's a small part like this versus, once you have the whole section and it gets stuck in one of the parts. So make sure that the carbon tubes fit, and then make sure that all your parts fit together and you got all the seams cleaned up. I cleaned off all the brims and everything. We'll start gluing this thing together and we'll get it ready for the maiden flight. These are 1 meter, 8mm carbon tubes. You want to make sure that you cut off 35mm off of each one first, and that'll go on the rear part of the wing. And then we're going to mark 120mm with a Sharpie so that we know exactly where to position that longer tube in the wing. And we'll glue this smaller portion onto the wing, and then we'll do the same with this longer tube. We'll add glue to that, and they'll insert that right into that line that we drew with 120mm sticking out. And then we'll glue all the wing sections together. So I did use PETG to print all these wing sections out. I don't recommend using PETG just because it warps so bad. I had to use brims and a lot of bed adhesion stuff to try to get these wing sections to print out correctly. And if you use PLA, just regular PLA, it works a lot better and you won't have as much problems that I has with it. But I just had problems with availability with PLA, so that's why I use PETG for this build. This wing fastener works really well. It's very nice to take this airplane out, not have any tools required or anything, just to like throw the wings on and put that fastener into the fuselage. So it works really well to assemble the wings for this airplane. Now I'll start assembling the ailerons for this airplane. Just glue the two sections together, and then I'll just add a little dab of CA glue to the TPU hinges, insert them into the ailerons, and then add a little dab of CA glue and add them right into the wing. I really like these spoilers. They add a lot of detail to this plane, and they work really good. When I was out there flying it, they just worked really good to get the plane down and slow it down a little bit. So to hook these up is a little challenging for me because I am using a 6-channel radio and therefore a 6-channel receiver. So I had to hook up the spoilers and the ailerons in a Y-harness configuration, which can be done. It's just a little bit challenging to get the spoilers hooked up. For the ailerons, it's not a problem because you're using a push rod collar and you can just have it loose and just get the two ailerons perfectly lined up with the Y-harness. It's not a problem. But this portion, it is challenging because you have to get these servos positioned just exactly correct to get the spoilers to hook up correctly. So if you have the ability to use like a 7-channel or 8-channel radio, definitely hook up the spoilers independently so you can trim them, and then hook up the ailerons with a Y-harness. To insert the spoilers into the wings, we'll just use these 70mm 1.2mm carbon rods. For one side, you just add it in there and just set the spoiler in place, and then the other side you kind of have to bend the rod a little bit and then just click it into place. And then we use double stick adhesive to stick the servo in place, and there's a little line inside of that wing there, and you want to make sure that's lined up to have the pivot point correctly. Also, you want to make sure that you hook up the servo to your receiver and your radio, and it actually uses almost the whole movement of the servo. So I actually had to hook the servo up, basically make it like -100, set the servo in place, and that way it can travel from -100 all the way to +100 to get that slat to move like all the way fully closed to like fully open. So because I'm using a Y harness to hook up the spoilers, I can't actually change the direction of the spoiler on the transmitter. So I have to actually change the linkage setup and put the linkage on the other side so I can put the servos facing the same direction so that they work the correct direction with a Y harness. I actually waited to install these wingtips until after I had the spoilers hooked up because without these wingtips on there, the wings will sit flat on the build table, so I can work on those spoilers while the wing's sitting flat. And then once I have the spoilers all set up, then I glued the wingtips in place and cut those support brackets out for the ailerons, and then we'll set these aileron servos up. I'm using ASK14 servos for the ailerons also. I used just a steel wire to snake these wires into the wing. It's kind of a long stretch there, so I couldn't get the servo wire to go down into the wing. So I just used the steel wire, and then I just hooked it to the end of that servo wire extension and pulled that wire through. Okay, just like with all the other servo setups, we need to make sure we hooked up the controller and center the servos, so that way that control horn is positioned correctly. You want that control horn to be at a 90-degree angle for setting up the controls for the ailerons. So we'll do that for both of them, and again I'm using a Y harness for the ailerons. I'm using 1.2 millimeter steel wire with a Z-bend on one end, and then I'm gonna just add glue to this control horn, set that in place, and then we want to turn our receiver on and turn our transmitter on, center the servos, and then I'm gonna use a little piece of tape and tape the aileron to the wing to line up the trailing edge of the wing with the aileron, and then we'll have it in the correct position. We'll tighten down the set screw, and then we'll cut this steel wire to length. So one of my favorite things about this airplane is just how easily these wings are removed and installed. This glider just has a really large wingspan, and it's just awesome just to take off the wings, throw it in the back of your car, take it out and go fly it. It just works great. So we're going to turn on the transmitter and the receiver and check all of our controls, make sure the spoilers and the ailerons work correctly with that Y harness setup that I did. And then next thing we're going to do is set up the CG. So we'll put on the cowling there, check the CG, and as you can see here that the tail is pretty heavy. So we're going to have to put some lead in the nose. So if you take off the propeller and the cowling, just below the motor mount there's a location for some lead weight. So we're going to add some lead here, and then we'll check the CG here. It's still a little bit tail heavy, so we'll put one more section here just next to the motor mount, and that'll set the CG right where we want it. So we went with that in that lead weight in the nose. I think it was around 60 grams of lead weight in the nose I added there. It came in at 1,730 grams ready to fly weight, and that's with a 3-cell 2,700 milliamp battery. This glider turned out so good. I had such a good time building it. It's a really fun airplane to see come together. The spoilers work really good. The wheels and the wingtips and this retractable landing gear and the fuselage is a really cool feature to this airplane. It's really cool, like self-sufficient plane. You can just take it out and just takes off with that one wheel and lands really easily. I hadn't flown any gliders before this, and this just flew great. I didn't have any problems with it at all. Definitely recommend building this. If you guys want the STL files, you can get them from planeprint.com. I'll have a link for that in the description. I have links to all the parts I use and materials I use, so you guys can order up all your parts and watch my build videos and follow along and build your planes. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. If you guys like other videos like this, check out my YouTube channel. I've got lots of other 3D printed airplanes on there, and we will see you guys in the next build.